the treacherous Ned Rackham is discovered, and Blackbeard makes a legendary last stand. Ralph D. Paine, today on the Classic Tales podcast. Welcome to the Classic Tales podcast. Thank you for listening. The Audiobook Library Card is the perfect solution if you can't get enough classic audiobooks. Unlimited downloads and streaming of the entire Classic Tales library for $9.99 a month. Use the coupon code ClassicTales2 and save $3 off your first month. You can also subscribe yearly at the lower price if you like. Go to audiobooklibrarycard.com or follow the link in the show notes. The Audiobook Library Card is an all-you-can-eat smorgasbord of classics I've been building for the last 18 years. Many have won awards. Only about a quarter of the library has been on the podcast. And with the Audiobook Library Card, you gain access to everything, all you want. So head on over to audiobooklibrarycard.com and start listening. One thing I wanted to mention as our Blackbeard story starts to wind down. When Blackbeard made his last stand, and the author mentions how hard he is to kill, he's not kidding. When Maynard examined Blackbeard's body, he discovered that he was shot in 5 different places and had been stabbed or otherwise cut 20 times. Just a little gruesome detail for you. Also, so I guess this is a second thing, the captains of the ships of this story really existed. Stede Bonnet was a pirate known for his high code of conduct. Lieutenant Maynard was the one who swore to take down Blackbeard and had a final duel with him. Ned Rackham is likely an embellishment of Calico Jack Rackham, who may have sailed with Blackbeard but certainly knew him. Feel free to dive down any rabbit holes you need to double-check. And now, Blackbeard Buccaneer, Part 7 of 8, by Ralph D. Paine. Chapter 15. Mr. Peter Forbes mourns his nephew. It seems a long time in the course of this story since the Honorable Secretary of the Council, Mr. Peter Arbuthnot Forbes, was forced to sail into Charlestown from the Plymouth Adventure on that most humiliating errand of finding medicines for Blackbeard's fever-smitten rogues. For the sake of his own dear nephew and the other hostages detained on board, he had endeavored to perform his bargain and was returning across the bar when the threatening clouds and other portents of a violent storm caused the seamen to lose heart. They put about and drove back into the harbor for shelter in the very nick of time. These were pirates from Blackbeard's crew, it may be recalled, with his grizzled, scarred boatswain at the tiller. They had felt safe enough to swagger and ruffle it through the streets of Charlestown and to terrify the people. Their worthless lives were protected by the hostages, who waited in fear and trembling. The town seethed with indignation and was hot with shame. There would be no more of the friendly traffic with pirates. It was fully believed that the wretched Blackbeard would be as good as his word in allowing no more than 2 days' grace. Therefore, when Mr. Peter Forbes came back in the boat to inform his neighbors that he had been unable to reach the ship, it was sadly taken for granted that those helpless passengers had been put to death. Forthwith, the pirates of the boat's crew were seized and thrown in jail. There they lay in double irons until the council met and ordered them to be tried. In accordance with the verdict, the 6 seamen and the boatswain were promptly hanged by the neck from the same gallows at White Point, hard by the town. And the people no longer shivered at the name of Blackbeard, nor feared his vengeance. Their fighting blood was thoroughly aroused. Not long after this, there arrived from England a new governor of the province, a man of honor and resolution, who approved what he had done. This Governor Johnson proceeded to organize the town for defense, building batteries on Sullivan's Island, recruiting the seafaring men in the militia, and seeking to obtain merchant vessels which could be employed as armed cruisers. Learning that the governor of North Carolina was in a corrupt partnership with pirates, he sent messages to Virginia to solicit cooperation. This activity made much work for Secretary Peter Forbes, who forsook his intention of going to England to beg the cooperation of His Majesty's government against the plague of pirates. Dapper and plump and important as of yore, his florid face was clouded with sorrow, as he seemed a much older man. He mourned his nephew, Jack Cockrell, as no more, and felt as though he had lost an only son. Every angry word he had ever addressed the lad, every hasty punishment inflicted, hurt him grievously. It was a solace to talk with winsome Dorothy Stewart, because hers was the bright optimism of youth, and she had so exalted an opinion of Jack's strength and courage that she refused to abandon hope, and the fact that he had confided to her his rash intention of running away and signing as a pirate sooner than be transported to school in England persuaded her that he might be alive. "From what you saw yourself, Mr. Forbes," said she, "when Blackbeard boarded the Plymouth Adventure with his dreadful men, our Jack won his fancy."
"So it appeared, Dorothy. The boy boasted of knocking a tall pirate on the head, and he read this monster of a pirate more shrewdly than I. Yes, Blackbeard took it with rough good humour, but Jack would ne'er consent to sail with him. 'Twas that confounded Stede Bonnet and his gallant air that turned the lad's head. He cast a glamour over this trade of murder and pillage."
"Be that as it may," returned Dorothy, with a sigh and a smile, "I confess to a romantic admiration for this bold Captain Bonnet. He wears an air of mystery, which is most becoming. We must not blame poor Jack."
No, I am done with all that," hastily exclaimed Uncle Peter. "All I dare hope is that when Blackbeard is captured, we may learn what fate befell the boy. It makes the torture worse to have him vanish without a trace."
"And yet I have faith the sea will give him back to us, Mr. Forbes. He will find you a chastened guardian, not so apt to box his ears." Uncle Peter was so distressed by this gentle raillery that the girl begged pardon and vowed that she would never again offend. It so happened that they were sitting together in Parson Throckmorton's garden, a day or so after this, when a friend came running in with tidings the most unexpected and incredible. A Negro slave had come from a plantation a few miles inland, and he bore a letter written by none other than Captain Jonathan Welsby of the Plymouth Adventure. It narrated how he and the survivors of his ship had journeyed that far before weeks of suffering and frequent skirmishes with Indians. They were compelled to rest and take shelter before undertaking the last stage of the journey. Councillor Peter Forbes was magically changed. He shed his dignity and threw his hat in the air. Clasping Miss Dorothy's slender waist, he planted a kiss on her damask cheek. Parson Throckmorton was ramming snuff into his nostrils, his wig all awry, while he sneezed trumpet blasts of rejoicing.
"Survivors! God bless me, that lusty stripling will be amongst them. He can survive anything but Greek and Latin. I will spare the rod in future."
"I told you so, Uncle Peter Forbes," laughed Dorothy.
"Not so fast,"
quoth he, in a mood suddenly sobered.
"Captain Welsby includes no list of those in his party."
"But of course one of them is sure to be Master Jack," she insisted.
"I am a selfish man, and a laggard officer of the Crown,"
he exclaimed, with an air of great self-reproach.
"There are women in that company, and wounded men, no doubt. We must take them clothing, horses, food, a surgeon."
He bustled off to the governor's house to find that energetic gentleman absent at Sullivan's Island. Acting for him, the secretary of the council sent the town crier to summon all good citizens to the tavern green. In the space of an hour, the men and supplies were assembled, and with Mr. Forbes in command, the Band of Mercy made haste to reach the plantation. During the march, there was a buzz of anxious surmise. Was this one and that alive or dead? Had the hostages been slain, and were these the sailormen of the Plymouth Adventure who had been set adrift by Blackbeard? Councillor Forbes winced at hearing such talk as this, but his heart beat high nevertheless. So confident was he that he was about to behold his manly nephew. There was loud cheering when they came to the cleared land of the indigo fields and saw a tattered British ensign fluttering from the log stockade, which enclosed the huts of the overseer and his labourers. In the gateway appeared the stalwart figure of Captain Welsby, in ragged garments and with a limping gait. Other men crowded behind him and responded with huzzas, which were a mere feeble echo. The friends from Charlestown rushed forward to embrace them, loudly demanding to know where the rest were. "We fetched the women safe through," answered Captain Welsby, whose eyes were sunken and the brown beard streaked with grey. 12 good men of my crew are dead, and 3 of the gentlemen passengers. The swamps took toll of some, and the Indians slew the others. We were besieged a fortnight by the Yamassees. A hard experience, all of it, and wondrous luck to have escaped. Councillor Forbes delayed while his companions entered the huts to attend the invalids. He struggled to ask a question, but his voice was beyond control. "I understand," kindly spoke the shipmaster. "Your lad is not with us, nor can I say if he be dead or alive."
"The Indians carried him off?"
weakly inquired the uncle. "No, he was never seen after we abandoned ship. Your Jack and a chum of his from Blackbeard's crew were for making the beach on a small raft of their own contrivance. This was after nightfall, Councillor, and what with a landward breeze and a crotchety set of the tide amongst the shoals, they floated out to sea."
"On a small raft," muttered Mr. Forbes, "and a vast ocean. I know of no ship voyaging to or from these ports which might have found them."
"I was in hope of hearing news of the lads from you," sorrowfully said the shipmaster. "There is a chance, tiny though it be, that they were sighted by some vessel bound to foreign parts across the Western Ocean." The uncle shook his head in a manner profoundly dejected. There were duties which summoned him, and he choked down his own grief, turning from the sympathetic mariner to minister to those in distress. Horse litters were soon ready for the exhausted but heroic women who had been kept alive by the devotion of the noble British seamen in accordance with the tradition of the merchant service. Those unable to walk farther were placed in carts. Clothed and fed, the sailors were in blithe spirits and talked of going to sea again as soon as they could find a ship. In the crowd which met them on the outskirts of the Charlestown settlement was Dorothy Stewart. She scanned the straggling column and then ran from one cart to another. It was impossible to convince her that Jack Cockrell was not there. But when she heard from Uncle Peter the news that Jack was missing and not surely dead, her faith burned anew, triumphant over fact and reason. "See how the great storm came to save him from Blackbeard," she cried, her hand nestling in Uncle Peter's arm. "And look how he came unscathed through that bloody battle with the pirates in the Plymouth Adventure. Why, a cruise on a raft is merely a frolic after all that."
"I would not discourage your dear dreams, sweet maid," was the gentle response, "and may they be truer than my own forebodings."
Charlestown was more than ever resentful when it learned from these poor people how the pirate sailing master, Ned Rackham, had plotted to get rid of them and how mournful had been their sufferings after the shipwreck. The one boat left to them had been too rotten to send along the coast, and they had plunged into a wilderness almost impassable. Meanwhile, Governor Johnson, stirred by this episode, had received word that the province of Virginia was both ready and anxious to join in an expedition against Blackbeard. Governor Spotswood of Virginia would be outfitting such craft as he could get together in the James River while he awaited a reinforcement from Charlestown. The best vessel available for immediate use was a small brigantine, the King George. There was no lack of eager seamen when Councillor Forbes and Colonel Stewart proclaimed the muster on the Tavern Green. Among those selected were several of Captain Jonathan Welsby's sailors, who were primed to fight even though there was not much flesh on their bones. He himself was a forlorn mariner who had lost his good ship and found no joy in life. With a grim smile of gratitude, he accepted the invitation to go as master of the King George, with Colonel Stewart as a sea soldier, to drill the men and lead them in action. It was while they were slinging guns aboard the brigantine that some of the men happened to notice a small boat coming into the harbor under a rag of sail. At first it was taken for a fishing craft, and there was no comment until it was quite close. Then they saw that it was a ship's jolly boat, much the worse for wear, with only 2 occupants. These were half-naked lads, burned black to the waist, with a queer kind of canvas headgear as a protection against the sun. The boat was steered to pass under the stern of the King George, and the crew was unable to fathom if these were pirates or victims of another shipwreck. Captain Welsby solved it by shouting, "Both your guesses are right. One is the pirate Yunker that served our cause in the Plymouth Adventure, and t'other is Master Jack Cockerell." One of the Charlestown's volunteers heard only the word pirate and growled with an oath, "Oh, when a Blackbeard's spawn. We'll make precious short work of him. Hand me a musket, and I will save trouble for the hangman." "Here, stop that," said Captain Welsby, beckoning his own men. "You old adventure hands know better. Quell these lubbers. If there's to be hostile feeling ashore, I shall take this lad aboard under my own protection." During this argument, the sea-worn pilgrims in the jolly boat had recognized the shipmaster and were joyfully yelling at him. In response to his gesture, they pulled down the sail and rowed to the gangway of the brigantine. There was no need to fear the wrath of the Charlestown seamen, because the adventure hands stood by as a guard while they explained how this young Joe Hawkridge had valiantly helped to turn the tide of battle against the prize crew of pirates. And there was such a rousing welcome for Master Cockerell that all else was forgotten. His old shipmates fairly mobbed him. "I will fire a gun and hoist all the bunting to signal the town," cried the skipper, his face shining. "And presently I'll send you to the wharf in my own boat. But first tell me, boys, who took you off the little raft, and whence come you in this ship's boat?" "Blackbeard rescued us, and we borrowed the boat from him," demurely answered Jack, watching the effect of this bombshell of a sensation. "Blackbeard?" echoed the bedazed shipmaster, and the others chimed it like a chorus. "Aye, old buckets of blood hisself," grinned Joe Hawkridge. "We had him tamed proper when we parted company. First we chased him through a swamp till his tongue hang out and left him mired to the whiskers. Then for another lark, we scared him in his own ship, so he begged us on his knees to forbear. We learned Captain Ed'd teach his manners, eh, Jack?" This was too much for the audience, which stood agape. A dozen voices at once implored enlightenment. With a lordly air for a youth whose costume was mostly one leg of his breeches, Master Cockerell reproved them, to wit, "Captain Stede Bonnet was more courteous to our distress when we sailed with him. He gave us a thumping big breakfast." "Right-o," declared Joe. "'Tis our custom to spin strange yarns for clothes and victuals in payment." The men scampered to the galley and pantry, but refused to let Captain Welsby carry these rare entertainers into the cabin. Graciously, they sketched the chief events, omitting all mention of the treasure chest, and Jack explained in conclusion, "And so I was stricken homesick, like an illness, and Joe had his fill of pirates too. The wind was wrong to rejoin Captain Bonnet in the inlet harbour, after we shipped his ghosts in the jolly boat, and we had a mariner's chart of the Carolina coast, and—" "But what did you do for subsistence?" broke in Captain Welsby. "Food and water," answered Joe. "Oh, we landed when the thirst plagued us too bad, and there was rain to fill a bite of the sail and a pannikin to save it in." "And we lived on oysters mostly," said Jack. "And Joe killed a fat opossum with a club, and we caught some fish in a net which I knotted from a ball of marlin that was in the boat, and we foraged for pawpaws and persimmons." "And whenever the freeze was fair, we put to sea again," said Joe. "And it was a long and weary voyage, though not so many leagues on the chart." The captain's boat was ready, and they tumbled in, 2 wayfarers of the sea who were as lean and sun-dried as the buccaneers of old Trimble Rogers' fond memories. Hardships had seasoned and weathered them, like good ash staves. On the wharf was Uncle Peter Forbes and Governor Johnson and a concourse of townspeople drawn by the joyous signals flown from the brigantine. Jack looked in vain for Dorothy Stewart, and was thankful that her welcome was deferred. Shears and a razor and Christian raiment would make him look less like a savage from the coast of Barbary. Uncle Peter wasted a vast deal of pity, thinking the castaways too weak and wasted to walk. Jack strode along with him, the crowd at their heels, and soon had the plump counselor puffing for breath. They insisted on taking Joe Hawkridge with them, although he was for seeking lodgings at the tavern. He was one of the household, declared Mr. Forbes, while Jack warned him to beware of impertinence, lest he be sentenced to chop wood for the kitchen fire. The neighbors and friends, as curious as they were joyful, were barred from the house, while the lads talked and Uncle Peter carefully made notes of it all. It was too much for him to realize that Jack was sitting there, lusty and laughing, and with the dutifully respectful manner as of yore, in spite of the man's part he had played to the hilt. Of all the exploits, that which most fascinated Mr. Peter Forbes was the chase after Blackbeard's sea chest, weighty with treasure, and the discovery of the knoll in the Cherokee swamp, where he might have buried other booty. Here was a picaresque romance, which allured the methodical barrister and counselor, and he was as boyishly excited as his nephew. He examined the chart which Jack had copied from his rude sketch, made on a piece of bark, and this raised a question which he was quick to ask. "What of Bill Saxey, and of this old bloodhound of a Trimble Rogers? As soon as Stede Bonnet could get the Revenge to sea, I have no doubt he sailed to Cape Fear River to get these pirate comrades of yours, and the seamen he left to find them. Once aboard, they would urge Bonnet to return to Cherokee Inlet and let them go hunt the treasure." "That may be, but we can't trust them to deal fair by us," replied Jack. "Possibly," was the skeptical comment. Mr. Forbes was not too ready to believe in honest pirates. "I'm not sure Captain Bonnet had a mind to bother with this treasure hunting," suggested Joe Hawkridge. "Leastwise, he may have put it off to an easier day. He has friends that keep him well informed, such as the governor of North Carolina at Bathtown, and all this flurry against pirating, here and in Virginia, would be apt to make Captain Bonnet wary of being trapped on the coast." "Joe is full of wisdom, as usual," said Master Cockerell, "and if Blackbeard has cruised to the Spanish Main, as we suspect, the treasure may lie undisturbed for a while." "Concerning Blackbeard, the evidence then in hand warranted your conclusions," was Uncle Peter's judicial comment. "But I have received later information. The rumor is, and well founded, that he turned his ship and made for the Pamlico River with the intention of obtaining pardon from the false and greedy Governor Eden. This would baffle our plans against him, or so he would assume, and it would enable him to remain within convenient distance of his treasure." "Would this province in Virginia respect such a pardon as that?" queried Jack. "Not in the case of Blackbeard," snapped the counselor, "because we know it would be violated as soon as this treacherous villain could safely return to his piracies." "Then Joe and I will enlist in the King George brigantine," cried Jack. "Captain Wellesby tells me she will sail for Virginia inside the week." Uncle Peter was about to make a violent protest, but he checked himself, and his emotions were torn betwixt pride and yearning affection. He could not bear to let his nephew go so soon to new perils, but what right had he to try to shield him when the public duty called? It was idle to pretend that Jack was too young and tender to embark on such service as this. He was fitter for it than some of the other volunteers. And so the unhappy Uncle Peter walked the floor, with his cheeks puffed out and his hands clasped behind him, and said with a tremulous sigh, "I swore to treat you no more as a child, Jack. 'Tis right and natural for you to desire to go in the King George as a fighting man tried and true. As for Joe Hawkridge, I have acquainted the governor with his merits, and his pardon is assured." "Thank ye, sir," returned the reformed young pirate. "A respectable life is what I crave, and the pardon for company." "It sounds almost pleasant to me, including the parson," admitted Jack, "as soon as we shall have settled this matter with Blackbeard." Chapter 16. Ned Rackham's plans go much amiss. The armed brigantine had been out several days on the voyage to Virginia when a vessel was sighted hull down. Captain Welsby and Colonel Stewart decided to edge over and take a look at the stranger, although they were not anxious to engage an enemy of heavier metal. If, however, this should happen to be Blackbeard in the Revenge, they were in no mood to avoid him, despite the odds. After an hour of sailing in a strong breeze, it was seen that this other vessel was a small merchantman, which shifted her course as though to shake off pursuit.
"They'd take us for a pirate," chuckled Captain Welsby. "I have no wish to scare 'em, poor souls. They will feel easy as soon as we bring the wind abeam."
He was about to give the order when Joe Hawkridge, gunner's mate, called to Jack Cockrell, standing as watch at the helm.
"Remember the snow I told you of? Yonder is the same rig and tonnage, alike it as peas in a pod."
Jack spoke to the shipmaster, who summoned Joe to the quarterdeck. The boy was confident that this was the New England coasting vessel in which Ned Rackham and his pirates had appeared off Cherokee Inlet, and had carried the maroon seamen from the Sandy Cay.
"A brown patch in the big main topsail, and the bowsprit steeved more than ordinary," said Joe. "Tit for tat, Captain Welsby. Your men can have the fun of jamming them in the forecastle, and you won't find me or Jack helping those picaroons to break out."
"No fear of that," sternly spoke the shipmaster. "They shall make their exit with a taut rope and a long drop when I deliver them in Virginia." It was to be gathered that the bold Ned Rackham had failed in his desperate enterprise of capturing a larger ship, and that he was probably cruising up the coast in hopes of rejoining Blackbeard. The Snow had too few guns to cope with the King George brigantine, which could throw a battering broadside. As soon as identification was certain, Captain Welsby hauled to windward to hold the weather gauge, and Colonel Stewart called the men to quarters. The Plymouth Adventure hands were disappointed that they would be unable to pay their own grudge. They had no doubt that Ned Rackham would strike his colours without a battle. The King George ran close enough for Captain Welsby to shout through the trumpet,
"The Snow ahoy! Send your men aboard or I'll sink you! No tricks, Rackham! Lively now!"
They saw the men running to cut the boat lashings and struggle to launch the boats from the deck. Ned Rackham, handsome and debonair, stared coolly at the brigantine, but gave no sign that he had heard the ultimatum. With a shrug, he walked across the poop, glanced up at the British ensign which flew from his main truck, and made no motion to pull it down.
"Blow your matches, boys!"
roared Colonel Stewart from his station in the waist of the King George.
5 minutes grace, no more!"
Captain Welsby said to wait a little. The pirates were endeavoring to quit the Snow, and presently Rackham appeared to change his own purpose. No longer ignoring the King George, he doffed his hat in a graceful flourish and bowed with a mocking obeisance. Then he strolled to the cabin hatch and went below, presumably to get a change of clothing or something of the sort. But he failed to reappear, and his men were in a frenzy of haste, with one boat already in the water. So incensed was Colonel Stewart by the insolent refusal of Ned Rackham to strike his colours in token of surrender that he gave orders to fire at the mainmast and try to bring it down. An instant before the starboard battery thundered, the Snow seemed to fly upwards in a tremendous explosion. The masts were flung out of her, and the hull opened like a shattered basket. So violent was the shock that the men were thrown to the deck of the King George, as she quivered, as though her bows had rammed a reef. Black smoke spouted from the crater, and debris rained down on a boiling sea. A few survivors, scorched or half-stunned, were clinging to bits of wreckage and wailing for succor. Where the Snow had floated was a discoloured eddy, broken timbers, a lather of dirty foam. Captain Jonathan Welsby picked himself up, rubbed a bump on his head, and gazed wildly at the tragic scene. Collecting his wits, he exclaimed, "That'd be like Ned Rackham, to blow up the ship sooner than be taken and hanged. More than likely he had the train all laid to the powder barrels."
"He saved us a lot of trouble,"
said Colonel Stewart, as he climbed to the poop.
"A fellow of iron will and courage, this Rackham, by all accounts. I have conceived a respect for him."
"I forgive him his sins," replied the skipper.
Now, lads, boats away, and fish up those dying wretches."
Joe Hawkridge emitted a jubilant whoop and dived over the rail without waiting for a boat. He had caught a glimpse of a feeble swimmer whose square, solid features and bushy brows were familiar. It was Peter Toby, the carpenter's mate, who had befriended him on the quay and who had set adrift that miraculous cask of food and water. A few strokes and Joe was at his side, clutching him by the neckband and towing him toward the King George like a faithful retriever. Ropes were flung to them, and Joe saw his good friend safely aboard before he went up the side. The carpenter's mate was both burned and bruised, but his hurts were not grievous, and he was able to drag himself aft with Joe as a crutch.
"My own particular prize, sir, by your gracious leave," said Joe Hawkridge, addressing Captain Welsby. "This is Mr. Peter Toby, a poor, faint-hearted pirate like me. May I have him to keep, sir?"
"Bless me, but there will be no pirates left to hang," was the quizzical reply. "Master Cockerell has adopted you, and now I am ordered to be kind to Bill Saxby and Trimble Rogers if I meet up with them."
"That's the whole list, sir. Ask Jack Cockerell. You can string the rest of the bloody pirates to the yardarm for all we care. Do I get exemption for this, Peter Toby?"
"What is your verdict, Colonel Stewart?" asked the captain.
"I heard the tale from Hawkridge," answered the brusque but generous soldier. "The carpenter's mate has won my allegiance. What say you, in your own behalf, Peter Toby?"
The blistered, singed survivor touched a hand to his forehead and respectfully responded,
"A carpenter by trade and nature, and all this was. I never see one happy day a pirating, nor did I shed the blood of any human creature. With a bench and tools, you will find me a proper handy man in Charlestown."
"That clinches it," cried Colonel Stewart.
"I should call it a crime to hang an artisan like Peter Toby. Your prize is awarded you, Hawkridge. See that he is well cared for." "The first booty that was ever handed me from a sinking ship," said Joe. "Come along, Master Toby, and roll into my bunk. Verily I was casting bread upon the waters when I gave that cask to the wind and tide,"
devoutly murmured the carpenter's mate as he limped below with his new owner. No more than a dozen other pirates were rescued alive, and several of these expired soon after they were lifted aboard the brigantine. This was the only sensational incident of the coastwise voyage to the James River. Comfortably quartered, with no more work than was wholesome, Jack Cockerell and Joe Hawkridge thought it a holiday excursion after their previous adventures at sea. In the roadstead of the James were 2 men of war, small frigates, flying the broad pennant of the Royal Navy. A conference was held in the cabin of the senior officer, to which Captain Welsby and Colonel Stewart were invited. The latest advices made it seem certain that Blackbeard still lurked off the coast of the Carolinas. Planters had reported seeing his ship in Pamlico Sound, and it was also learned that he had been in communication with the disloyal Governor Eden at Bathtown. A letter had been intercepted, in handwriting of the governor's secretary, and addressed to Captain Teach, which included these words:
"I have sent you 4 of your men. They are all I can meet with about town. Be upon your guard."
This was readily construed to mean that Blackbeard was in haste to recall such of his crew as had strayed ashore. At the council of war in the frigate's cabin, a proclamation was read. It offered a handsome reward for the capture of Captain Edward Teach, dead or alive, and lesser rewards for other pirates. It was the decision that the 2 frigates were unhandy for cruising inshore. Therefore officers and men would be chosen from them to fill the complements of 2 sloops, light and active craft, which would be unhampered by batteries of cannon. They would be employed for boarding Blackbeard's ship, while the Charlestown brigantine King George should convoy them and engage in the attack if the depth of water should permit. The naval officer selected to command the sloops was Lieutenant Maynard, who went off to the King George to inspect her and make a call of courtesy. He was especially cordial to Master Cockerell and gunner's mate Joe Hawkridge, laying aside the stiff dignity of naval rank. To his persuasive argument that they enter the royal service with promise of quick promotion, they turned a deaf ear, although they were wonderfully taken with him. He was a gentle, soft-spoken young man, with a boyish smile, who blushed when pressed to talk of his own exploits against the Spanish, the Dutch, and the French in Britannia's wooden walls. His own questions were mostly about Blackbeard's fighting quality. Would he make a stand against disciplined tars who were accustomed to close in, hammer and tongs? Joe Hawkridge answered to this.
I ne'er saw him play action against a king's ship, and all his wild nonsense is apt to delude you into thinking him a drunken play-actor. But you will never take him alive, so long as those bandy legs have strength to prop him up.
I look forward to meeting him with a deal of pleasure. It may be my good fortune to measure swords with him, observed Lieutenant Maynard. Joe Hawkridge was puzzled by this gentle fire-eater with the complexion of a girl. Nothing could have been more unlike the ramping, roaring pirates of Blackbeard's dirty crew, who tried to terrify by their very appearance. After the lieutenant had returned to his frigate, Jack Cockrell remarked, "A most misleading man, Joe. You cannot picture him seeking the bubble reputation at the cannon's mouth, as Will Shakespeare saith."
"Blackbeard will bite him in two," replied Joe. "He is too pretty to be risked in such a slaughter-pen. I own up to feeling squeamish on my own account, hardy pirate though I be."
"This Lieutenant Maynard is welcome to measure swords with Blackbeard," said Jack, "and I shall not quarrel with him for the honour. Pick me a pirate with a wooden leg, Joe, or one that still shakes with Spanish fever."
"My only chance of getting out with a whole skin is to lug a sack of flour under one arm and play the ghost of Jesse Strawn."
Expeditiously, the brigantine and the two sloops sailed out of the James River to head for the North Carolina coast, and first rake the nooks and bays of Pamlico Sound. There was no intention of offering Blackbeard fair odds in battle. With men and vessels enough, it was resolved to exterminate him, like ridding a house of rats or other vermin. If he had gone out to sea, then the pursuers would wait, and watch for his return to his favorite haunts in these waters. There is every reason to believe, however, that he was concealed inshore, within easy distance of his friend, Governor Eden. Failing to find him in Pamlico Sound, it was debated whether to cruise farther to the southward. Now, Master Jack Cockrell and his chum had said nothing to the officers concerning the treasure in the Cherokee Swamp. They felt bound in honor not to reveal it without the consent of Bill Saxby and old Trimble Rogers, who were partners in the enterprise. Moreover, Lieutenant Maynard and the Virginia officers would feel bound to turn the treasure over to the Crown or its representatives. Governor Eden of North Carolina would undoubtedly claim it as found within his territory, and this meant that he would steal most of it for himself. It thrilled the lads when Colonel Stewart told them that this provincial squadron would cruise as far as Cherokee Inlet before working to the northward again. Information had led the officers to believe that Blackbeard had lost many men by desertion when his ship lay at Bathtown and nearby. They had been roving about the plantations and making a nuisance of themselves, and seemed ready to quit their red-handed despot of a master. In this event, he might have sought his old hiding place at the inlet sooner than risk a clash with the force which had been sent after him, and of which he had been warned by Governor Eden. Lieutenant Maynard scouted in advance with the two sloops, because there was small danger of their getting aground, and they could be moved along with oars if the wind failed. The brigantine kept further offshore, but within signaling distance. She was running within sight of the scattering barrier of low islands when Captain Welsby summoned Joe Hawkridge and informed him, "You will act as pilot, Joe, once we fetch sounding on the 12-fathom bank. The chart is faulty, as you know, and me and my mates are in strange waters with a mighty little elbow room. You know the marks, I take it?"
"Aye, sir, that I do,"
answered Joe.
"And I stays aboard ship and miss the chance to go poking about with a cutlass. I'm all screwed up to terrible deeds, Captain Welsby, after a spell of mortal fear. And who takes care of Master Cockrell if he goes in a boat?"
"His own lusty right arm, Joe. Avast with your melancholy. We must first catch this Blackbeard." Presently, Joe Hawkridge footed it up to the main shrouds to scan the sea ahead and try to get a glimpse of that sandy bit of exposed shoal on which he had been marooned. This would enable him to find the entrance to the outer channel and so calm the brigantine in from seaward. When he shaded his eyes with his hand against the glare of the morning sun, One of the sloops hoisted a string of bright signal flags and fired 2 guns. The other sloop was seen to lower her topsail and wait for the King George to come up. Joe Hawkridge climbed higher and found a perch where he could discern the spars of a vessel etched almost as fine as threads against the azure horizon. He was almost certain that the ship he saw was very close to that tiny quay of which he had such unhappy knowledge. Soon he was able to perceive that the vessel's sails were furled. This was an odd place for an anchorage. His conjecture was confirmed when the King George passed close to the nearest sloop, and Lieutenant Maynard shouted, "Stranded hard and fast, and she is deucedly like Blackbeard's brig." Scampering to the deck, Joe Hawkridge mustered his gun's crew as Jack Cockerell came running up to say, "Trapped on the very islet where he cast you and the other pirates. His chickens have come home to roost."
"Call me no pirate, or I'll stretch you with a handspike," grinned Joe. "'Tis a plaguey poor word in this company. Aye, Captain Ed'ard Teach had a taste of his own medicine, and he will get a worse dose this day than he ever served me."
Chapter 17. The Great Fight of Captain Teach. Yes, there was Blackbeard's ship, hard in the sand which had gripped her keel while she was steering to enter the Cherokee Inlet. There was no pearly vapor of swamp mist out here to shroud her from attack. The air was clear and bright, with a robust breeze which stirred a flashing surf on the shoals. Under lower sails, the 2 sloops watchfully crept nearer until their crews could examine the stranded brig and read the story of her plight. She stood on a slant, with the decks sloped toward the enemy. That made it impossible to use her guns with any great effect. Captain Welsby tacked the ship and kept the King George well away from the quay, as Joe Hawkridge advised. With an ebbing tide, it was unsafe to venture into shallower water in order to pound Blackbeard's vessel with broadsides. Lieutenant Maynard came aboard in a small boat, and was quite the dandy with his brocaded coat and ruffles and velvet smallclothes. One might have thought he had engaged to dance the minuet. Colonel Stewart met him in a spick-and-span uniform of His Majesty's foot, crossbelts pipe-clayed white as snow, boots polished until they shone. Such gentlemen were punctilious in war 200 years ago. "Your solid shot will not pound him much at this range, my good sir," said the lieutenant. "With his hull so badly listed towards us, you can no more than splinter the decks while his men take shelter below." "I grant you that," regretfully replied the soldier. "And case shot will not scatter to do him much harm. Shall I blaze away and demoralize the rascals, while you make ready your boats? Toss a few rounds into the varlets, Colonel Stewart. It may keep them from massing on deck. 1 boat from your ship, if it please you, with 20 picked men. I shall take 20 men from each sloop as boarders." "60 in all?" queried the colonel. "Why not take 100? They would be tumbling over one another. Too much confusion. This is not a large vessel yonder. We must have room on deck to swing and cut." "I will have my men away in 10 minutes, Lieutenant Maynard," crisply replied the blond, raw-boned Scotsman, with a finger at his hat brim in courteous salute. He proceeded to call the men by name, strapping sober fellows who had followed the sea amid the frequent perils of the merchant service. Jack Cockerell was the only landsman, and he felt greatly honored that he should be included. Gone was his unmanly trepidation. Was he more worthy to live than these humble seamen who fought to make the ocean safer for other voyagers, who were true kinsmen of the Elizabethan heroes of blue water? He tarried a moment to wring Joe Hawkridge's hand in farewell, and to tell him, "If I have ill luck in this adventure, old comrade, do you mind presenting my best compliments and a fond farewell to Miss Dorothy Stewart?"
"Strike me, Jack. Stow that, or you'll have me blubbering," said Joe. "Bring me a lock of Captain Teach's whiskers as a token for my lass and fail, if ever I clap eyes on her again. And you'd best take this heavy cutlass which I whetted a purpose for ye. 'Twill split a pirate like slicing an apple." With this useful gift in his hand, Master Cockerell swung himself into the boat, where Colonel Stewart stood in the stern sheets. Perhaps he too was dwelling on a fair maid named Dorothy, who might be left fatherless before the sun climbed an hour higher.
The sloops were moving nearer the quay under sail and oar, trailing their crowded boats behind them. Blackbeard had hauled 2 or 3 of his guns into such positions that he could open fire, but the sloops crawled doggedly into the shoal water and so screened their boats until these were ready to cast off for the final dash. It was a rare sea picture. The stranded brig with canvas loose on the yards and ropes streaming, her listed decks aswarm with pirates in outlandish, varicolored garb, the surf playing about her in a bright dazzle, and the gulls screaming overhead. The broad, squat figure of Blackbeard himself was never more conspicuous. He no longer strutted the quarterdeck, but was all over the ship, menacing his men with pistols, shifting them in groups for defense, shouldering bags of munitions, or heaping up the grenades and stink pots to be lighted and thrown into the attacking boats. It was his humor to adorn himself more elaborately than usual. Under his broad hat with a great feather in it, he had stuck lengths of tow matches, which were all sputtering and burning, so that he ran to and fro in a cloud of sparks and smoke, like that evil one whom he professed to admire. He realized, no doubt, that this was likely to be his last stand. The inferno, which he was so fond of counterfeiting, fairly yawned at his feet. And now the sloops let go their anchors, while from astern of them appeared the 3 boats of the assailants. They steered wide of each other to seek different parts of the pirate brig, and so divide Blackbeard's force. The boats of Colonel Stewart and Lieutenant Maynard were racing for the honor of first place alongside. Blackbeard trained 2 guns on them, filled with grape and chain shot, and one boat was shattered, but it swam long enough for the cheering men to pull it to the brig and toss their grapples to the rail, which was inclined quite close to the water. They were in the surf which broke against the ship, but this was a mere trifle. Most of them went up the side like cats, leaping for the chains and dead-eyes, slashing at the nettings, swinging by a rope's end, or digging their toes in a crack of a gun-port. Forward, they were pouring over the bowsprit, vaulting like acrobats from the anchor stocks, or swarming up the stays. It seemed beyond belief that they could gain footing on the decks with Blackbeard's demons stabbing and hacking and shooting at them, but in such a manner as this was many a great sea fight won in the brave days of old. Lieutenant Maynard gained his lodgment in the bows amid a swirl of pirates who tried to pen him in front of the forecastle house. But his tars of the Royal Navy were accustomed to close quarters, and they straightway made room for themselves. Chest to chest and hand to hand, they hewed their way toward the waist of the ship, where Colonel Stewart raged like the braw, bonny Highlander that he was. Almost at the same time the 3rd boat had made fast under the jutting stern gallery, and its 20 men were piling in through the cabin windows like so many human projectiles. In the King George brigantine, Captain Jonathan Welsby fidgeted and gnawed his lip, with a telescope at his eye, while he watched the conflict in which he could scarce distinguish friend from foe. He could see Blackbeard charge aft to rally his men, and then whirl back to lunge into the melee, where towered Colonel Stewart's tall figure. The powder smoke from pistols and muskets drifted in a thin blue haze. Joe Hawkridge was fairly shaking with nervousness as he said to the skipper, "There'll be no clearing the decks, lest they down that monster of a Captain Teach, and he has more lives than a cat. See you, my dear crony, Master Jack?" "No, I cannot make him out in that mad turmoil," replied Captain Welsby. "Nip and tuck, I call it, Joe." This was the opinion forced upon Lieutenant Maynard, as he saw the engagement resolve itself into a series of bloody whirlpools, his seamen and the pirates intermingled. He won his way past the forecastle into the wider spaces of the deck, with only a few of his 20 tars on their feet. Colonel Stewart was hard-pressed, and the boarders who had come over the stern had as much as they could do to hold their own. Thus far the issue was indecisive. Jack Cockrell had kept close to the colonel, and felt amazement that he was still alive. His cheek was laid open, a bullet had torn his thigh, and a powder burn streaked his neck, but he felt these hurts not at all. It was a nightmare from which there seemed no escape. He saw Blackbeard rush at him with a raucous shout of, "The scurvy young cockerel! He will ne'er crow again!" Colonel Stewart sprang between them. Blades clashed, and they were swept apart in another wave of jostling combat. A moment later, The colonel slipped and fell as a coal-black negro chopped at him with a broken cutlass. Jack Cockrell flew at him, and they wrestled until a hip-lock threw the negro to the deck, where the colonel made him one pirate less. Formidable as these outlaws were, they lacked the stern cohesion which had been drilled into the sailors of the Royal Navy, and likewise learned in the hard school of the merchant service. Very slowly, the odds were shifting against Blackbeard's crew. It was unmistakable when Lieutenant Maynard cut his way through to join Colonel Stewart, while the third group of boarders was advancing little by little from the afterquarter. This meant that the force was gradually uniting in spite of the furious efforts to scatter it. And now there came an episode which lives in history 2 centuries after that scene of carnage on the decks of the stranded brig. It has preserved the name of a humble lieutenant of the Royal Navy and saved it from the oblivion which is the common lot of most brave men who do and dare when duty beckons. Blackbeard was bleeding from a dozen wounds, and yet his activity was unabated. He was like a grizzly bear at bay. His men began to believe that his league with Satan, of which he obscenely boasted, had made him invulnerable. He was all that he had proclaimed himself to be, the wickedest and most fearsome pirate of the Western Ocean. And all the while, the slender, boyish Lieutenant Maynard, sailor and gentleman, had one aim in mind, and that was to slay Captain Edward Teach with his own hand. Nor was he at all content until he had cleared a path to where the hairy pirate was playing havoc with his broadsword. With a loud laugh in mockery, Blackbeard snatched a loaded pistol from one of his men and fired it at this foppish young officer, who presumed to single him out. The ball chipped Maynard's ear, and he dodged the pistol which was hurled at his head. It was curious to note a lull in the general engagement, a little interval of suspense, while men regained their breath or tried to staunch their wounds. They were unconsciously awaiting the verdict of this duel between their leaders. Jack Cockrell, for instance, finding himself alone by some chance, leaned against a stanchion and heard his own blood drip, drip on the deck. It was a fleeting respite. Blackbeard swung his sword with the might of those wide shoulders behind it. The lieutenant stepped aside like lightning, and the bright weapon whistled past his arm. Then they went at each other like blacksmiths, sparks flying as steel bit steel. Dexterity and a cool wit were a match for the pirate's untamable strength. Gory, snarling Blackbeard shortened his stroke to use the point. The lieutenant dropped to one knee, thrust upward, and found a vital spot. Blackbeard stood staring at him with wonder in his eyes. Then those thick, bowed legs gave way, and he toppled like a great tree uprooted. He passed out quietly enough, with no more cursing, and in this last moment of sensibility, his thoughts appeared to wander far to his youth, as a brisk merchant seaman out of Bristol port, for he was heard to mutter, with a long sigh, "A pretty babe as ever was, Molly, and the mortal image of its mother." To his waist, the sable beard covered him like a pall, and one corded arm was flung across his breast, and it showed the design of the skull and crossbones pricked in India ink. Then, as if the dead leader had issued the command, the surviving pirates began to fling down their weapons and loudly cry for quarter. They need not have felt ashamed of the resistance they had made up to this time, but now the delirium of combat had slackened, and Blackbeard was no more. 1 or 2 of his officers were alive, and they knew that the game was lost. Reinforcements could be sent from the sloops and the brigantine as soon as they were signaled for, and there was no flight from a stranded ship. Blackbeard had been able to infuse them with his own madness. Better chance the gallows than no quarter. Here and there a few of the most desperate dogs of the Spanish Main, who had followed Blackbeard's fortunes a long time, refused to surrender, but they were either shot down or overpowered. Captain Welsby was sending off 2 boats from the King George with his surgeon, and the sloops were kedging in closer to the quay with the rising tide. Half the seamen were beyond aid, and of the pirates, no more than 20 were alive. Jack Cockrell was thankful to have come off so lightly, and he consoled himself with the notion that a scar across his cheek would be a manly memento. Colonel Stewart had been several times wounded, but 'tis hard killing a Highlander. It was Lieutenant Maynard's duty to offer public proof that he had slain none other than the infamous Blackbeard. Wherefore, he made no protest when his armorer hacked off the head of the dead pirate. There was no feeling of chivalry due a fallen foe, valiant though his end had been. This horrid trophy was tied at the end of a sloop's bowsprit, to be displayed for the gratification of all honest sailormen who might behold it in port. It was not a gentle age on blue water, and Captain Edward Teach had been the death of many helpless people during his wicked career. Lieutenant Maynard announced that he would take the 2 sloops into Bathtown before proceeding to Virginia, as they were overcrowded vessels, and the survivors of the boarding party needed proper care ashore. It would also afford the unscrupulous Governor Eden of North Carolina an opportunity to see his friend, Captain Teach, as a pirate who would divide no more plundered merchandise with him. The brigantine King George was ready to escort them into Pamlico Sound, after which she would sail for Charlestown. Before the departure from the entrance of Cherokee Inlet, the stranded vessel was set afire and blazed grandly as the funeral pyre of Blackbeard's stout lads, who would go no more a-roving. Never was nurse more devoted than Joe Hawkridge when his comrade was mercifully restored to him. Jack was woefully pale and weak, but in blithe spirits, and thankful to have seen the last of Blackbeard.
"Hauled in the leg and a damaged figurehead," said Joe, as he sat on the edge of the hero's bunk. "Trifling, I call it, when I expected to see you come aboard feet first, wrapped in a bit of canvas."
"I don't want to talk about it, Joe. Let's find something pleasant. Ho for Charlestown, and the green trees and a bench in the shade."
"And a tidy little vessel after a while. You and me and the counsellor are pleasuring up the coast, with men and gear to fish up the treasure chest."
"And you believe that Blackbeard never got back to the inlet to save the treasure for himself?" asked Jack.
"Not the way his ship was headed when she struck the shoal."
The brigantine was well on her way to Charlestown when Captain Welsby found that Master Cockerell could be carried into the comfortable main cabin to rest on a cushioned settle for an hour or 2 at a time. It was during one of these visits, when Joe Hawkridge was present, that the skipper remembered to say, "Here is a bit of memorandum which may entertain you, lads. Lieutenant Maynard had Blackbeard's quarters searched before the brig was burned. Some valuable stuff was found, but nothing what you'd call a pirate's treasure." The lads looked at each other, but kept their own counsel, and Captain Welsby went on to explain. "There was a private log, Blackbeard's own journal, with a few entries in it, and most of the leaves torn out. I made a copy of what could be read, for the late Captain Teach was a better pirate than scrivener. Here, Jack, you are the scholar." Jack read aloud this extract, which was about what might have been expected.
"Such a day. Rum all out. Our company somewhat sober. A confusion amongst us. Rogues a-plotting. Great talk of separation. So I looked sharp for a prize. Took one, with a great deal of liquor on board. So kept the company hot. Very hot. Then all things went well again."
"That sounds familiar enough to me," was Joe Hawkridge's comment. "And the rest of his writing will be much like it." "Not so fast," exclaimed Captain Welsby. "Scan the next page, Jack. 'Twill fetch you up all standing. Not that it puts gold in our pockets, for we know not where to search, but I swear it will make your eyes sparkle and your mouth water." Trying to hide his excitement, Jack saw a kind of rough inventory, and it ran like this.
"Where I hid it this cruise. One bag 54 silver bars. One bag 79 bars and pieces of silver. One bag coined gold. One bag dust gold. 2 bags gold bars. One bag silver rings and sundry precious stones. 3 bags unpolished stones. 1 silver box set with diamonds. 4 golden lockets. Also, 1 silver porringer, 2 gold boxons, 7 greenstones, rubies, great and small, 67, purple pieces of 8 and dollars. Also 1 bag lump silver and a small chain, and a coral necklace. 1 bag English crowns.
Captain Jonathan Welsby listened to the luscious recital with an air of mild amusement. He was of a temper too stolid and sensible to waste his time on random treasure hunting. Blackbeard might have chosen his hiding place anywhere along hundreds of leagues of coast. He could understand the agitation of these 2 adventurous lads, to whom this memorandum was like a magic spell. Of such was the spirit of youth.
"Any more of it?"
demanded Joe Hawkridge. "The next page was ripped out of the journal," answered the skipper. "What cruise did he mean? If it was this last one, he may have hit it on the Virginia or Carolina coast." Master Cockerell gave it as an excuse that he had sat up long enough and would return to his bunk. He was fairly bursting for a conference with Joe, and as soon as they were alone, he exclaimed, "It may be the sea chest. What do you think?"
"A handsome clue, I call it. Something to warm the cockles of your heart," grinned the sea urchin. "Aye, Jack, I should wager he wrote that down whilst he lay at anchor in Cherokee Inlet."
"It seems shabby of us to keep the secret from Captain Welsby, but there is an obligation on us."
"To Bill Saxby and the old Sea-Wolf," said Joe. "We'll not forget this trump of a skipper when it comes to splitting up the treasure."
"I'm anxious for Captain Bonnet and his crew," remarked Jack. "With this crusade against pirates afoot, our friends may be hanged before we see them again." This is B.J. Harrison. I hope you've enjoyed this unabridged production of Blackbeard Buccaneer Part 7 of 8 by Ralph D. Paine. If you've enjoyed this book, you might also enjoy Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, and you can listen to all the pirate tales you want with your Audiobook Library Card. Steer yourself over to audiobooklibrarycard.com now and click the appropriate button. Use the coupon code ClassicTales2 and save $3 on your first month. Thank you for joining me today and allowing classic literature to awaken your better self. Please join me next time, and we'll rediscover the greatest stories ever put to paper.